Welcome to Reformed Thinking. We're doing a deep dive today into a topic that feels pretty casual in our culture, but carries an immense, almost staggering weight in Scripture.
That's right.
We're talking about Christ's standard for marriage and divorce.
And it's so important that we really get into this because the modern view often treats divorce as almost routine. You hear phrases like no fault or just moving on.
Yeah, very neutral language.
Very neutral. And we're going to contrast that with the gravity the Bible assigns to the marital bond, which it sees as a covenant made before God.
So our mission for this deep dive is to look really closely at that divine standard. We'll be focusing on Jesus' teachings in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5, and how they connect back to the Old Testament law.
I think the core idea we'll unpack is that Jesus wasn't getting rid of the law. He was correcting how people were abusing it, how they twisted it with their legalism.
So he re-anchors marriage.
He re-anchors it to God's original design from creation. And when he does that, you see that this bond is so much heavier, so much more serious than any piece of human paperwork.
I get that then. We have to start where Scripture starts.
We have to. Back to the beginning.
Okay, so let's go all the way back to Genesis. This is where the whole biblical idea of relationships is set up. And marriage, from the very start, isn't presented as some human custom.
No, not at all. It's a divine act, an institution that God himself establishes.
And that's really the critical difference, isn't it?
It is. The nature of marriage is creational and it's covenantal. It's a divine joining, not just a human contract that you can renegotiate whenever you feel like it.
It's not a flexible social arrangement.
Exactly. And that's why Jesus, when he's arguing with the Pharisees late at hand, he goes right back to this. He says, "What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate."
That one sentence just completely changes the game.
It does. It removes human feelings or human autonomy as the final judge. The decision to break it apart becomes an offense against the one who started it, God. Hashtag tag hegeme, divine institution, and one flesh union.
So the foundational text for all of this, it has to be Genesis 2.24, right?
Absolutely. That's the one. It details the whole process of the one flesh union.
It lays out those three specific actions. A man will leave his father and mother.
Hold fast to his wife.
And the two become one flesh. And I think we really need to unpack that last phrase. What does one flesh actually mean here?
Well, the three parts together describe this total reorientation of life. You have a rupture of the first primary bond, your family, and the creation of a brand new one.
A new primary bond.
New primary bond. And one flesh, or besar echad in the Hebrew, is this all-encompassing concept. It's spiritual, physical, even legal.
So it's more than just a physical union.
Oh, much more. It includes that, of course, but it points to a kind of metaphysical merging of two people into one new reality before God. They are united in a way that's totally new and is meant to be permanent.
And this idea, this one flesh union, it dictates what marriage is for. You see this reflected later in, for instance, the Westminster Confession of Faith.
You do. The confession frames marriage as a covenant that God ordered for specific reasons.
And it lists three of them.
That's right. First, the mutual help of the husband and wife. Second, raising a godly seed, which points right back to that creation command to be fruitful and multiply. And third,
the prevention of uncleanness.
The prevention of uncleanness, which is a very realistic acknowledgement of our fallen nature. It says that this powerful human drive for intimacy needs to be channeled within the boundaries God set up. It's a structure for holiness and for stability.
So the whole theological anchor is this idea that God is the one doing the joining, forming this new one-flesh reality. And that means any talk about divorce has to start from the position that this bond is designed to last forever. Hashtag tag be divorce is covenant, treachery, and violence.
And once you accept that God instituted marriage, well, the whole moral status of divorce just shifts completely.
It's no longer just ending a contract.
Right. It becomes what the Bible calls covenant treachery. You see this so powerfully in the prophet Malachi. He's rebuking the men of his day for dealing treacherously with the wife of your youth, your companion, and your wife by covenant.
That phrase, wife by covenant, is so important. It wasn't just that they were leaving their wives.
No, it was that they were betraying a solemn, sworn oath, a covenant they made in the presence of God himself.
So it's being unfaithful to the spouse and to God at the same time.
Absolutely. God was the witness to the vow, and Malachi then He really drives the point home with some pretty severe language about how God views
He
this.
says God hates divorce.
He does. He says God hates divorce because it is like covering one's garment with violence. I mean, that is a dramatic and frankly shocking metaphor.
Covering one's garment with violence. What is that picture supposed to make us feel? That's so much more than God disapproves.
It is. In the ancient world, your garment often symbolized your identity, your public character. And the word for violence here, Hamas in Hebrew, it suggests destructive force, injury, injustice.
So you're staining your public identity with this act of destruction.
You are. It suggests that unjust divorce is not some morally clean administrative act. It's an act of violent treachery against your covenant partner. Tearing the relationship apart is like a physical assault that leaves a visible, lasting stain on you.
Okay, but that brings us to the big question. If marriage is this permanent, divine, one-flesh covenant, why does the law of Moses have rules for divorce?
Right.
I mean, we're talking about Deuteronomy 24. This law seems to acknowledge the practice, even regulate it.
This is where we run smack into the reality of sin. The creation ideal was broken, and broken quickly, and Moses is addressing this not by commanding divorce, but by, you could say, pragmatically regulating an evil that was already happening.
So Deuteronomy 24 is a concession.
It is fundamentally a concession to a fallen world. It is not an expression of God's perfect creational plan. It's a sad recognition of human failure. #A, the reason for the concession.
And it's Jesus himself who gives us the final authoritative interpretation of this law. He cuts right through all the rabbinic debates.
He does, and this is the key moment. The Pharisees challenge him, and Jesus confirms that Moses allowed divorce.
Because of your hardness of heart, but from the beginning it was not so.
That statement is just decisive. It roots the legal permission not in God's desire, but in human sin.
So the law wasn't a positive command from God like, go and divorce.
Yeah.
It was a response to a negative reality.
Exactly. It was a response to the sin of hard-heartedness, which was showing itself as cruelty, as neglect, as men just abandoning their wives. It was a failure of the kind of covenant-keeping character God demands.
So the allowance was a pragmatic measure to try and manage the fallout from that sin.
It was. It was a legal restraint on a practice that was already happening rather than some kind of positive endorsement of dissolving a marriage.
So really, if we want to understand Deuteronomy 24 correctly, we have to read it through the lens of what Jesus said about it.
You have to. It's an exception based on sin, not a charter for freedom. #B, regulation and protection.
That's a good way of putting it. A charter for freedom. It definitely wasn't a celebratory charter of divorce. So let's talk about its practical function.
Its main purpose was to regulate and restrain an evil that was already there. It assumed that marriages were failing because of male cruelty in a hard-hearted culture, and it was trying to contain the damage.
And a huge part of that was protecting the vulnerable person in the relationship.
Yep.
And in that society, that was almost always the wife.
Almost always. She had very little economic independence. And that's the real intent of the certificate of divorce. It was a protective measure. It stopped the woman from being treated like, a disposable piece of property.
Taken and discarded and then maybe taken back again when the husband felt like it.
Exactly. So by requiring a certificate, the law did a few things. It made the whole thing official. It forced the husband to slow down and actually consult someone to write it out.
It also gave the woman legal proof of her status, so she had permission to remarry.
It did. But most importantly, it included that rule against the first husband remarrying her if she had married someone else in the meantime.
Ah, okay. So that rule, that prohibition, what was the point of that?
It was a powerful check on frivolous divorce. A man couldn't just dismiss his wife because he was annoyed with her for a week, go try things out with someone else, and then decide to take her back.
It made the decision final from his side.
It did. It prevented him from trapping her in this cycle of abandonment and reclamation. It forced a degree of legal seriousness onto what could have been just a casual act of cruelty. It put the burden on the hard-hearted husband.
So that's the original intent of Moses.
Yeah.
A reluctant concession meant to restrain sin.
Yes.
But by the time of Jesus, the religious leaders had found a way to flip it on its head and use the law to license sin.
This is the critical turning point. The restraint of Deuteronomy 24 got completely distorted by religious tradition, and it happened mainly through what you could call legalistic minimalism.
Focusing only on the external act.
Exactly. Ignoring the heart, ignoring the seriousness of the covenant, and just focusing on the procedure.
And the entire debate in first century Judaism really hinged on one little phrase in Deuteronomy 24.
One phrase.
A husband could divorce his wife if he found some indecency in her. The Hebrew is erwat davar,
And that phrase became the theological battleground. It literally means something like nakedness of a thing or something indecent.
which is vague.
It's very vague, and that vagueness allowed for two major schools of thought to emerge, with completely opposite ideas about whether marriage was permanent or disposable.
So on one side you have the stricter school, the school of Shammai.
Shammai's followers tried to keep a high standard. They interpreted indecency to mean serious sexual immorality and nothing else.
Why? What was their reasoning?
They argued that the phrase erwat davar was often used in the Old Testament in contexts that had to do with illicit sexual acts. So they wanted to keep the exception as narrow as possible to uphold that original creational ideal.
But then you have the other school, the more lenient one from Rabbi Hillel.
Right. And Hillel's school was, unfortunately, the one that became much more popular. And this is where the distortion really takes off.
Because they just blew the definition wide open?
They did. They argued that some indecency could mean literally anything that displeased the husband. His subjective preference became the legal ground for ending the marriage.
And this stretched what was supposed to be a regulation of sin into this broad permission slip for divorce on the most trivial grounds.
I mean, when you look at the examples from rabbinic writings, it's actually shocking how trivial they are.
Like what?
Well, Hillel's school said a man could divorce his wife if she burned his dinner.
Burned his dinner.
Yes. Or if she was just a loud woman. And the most famous example is that a man could divorce his wife simply if he found another woman who was more beautiful.
Wow.
So losing your physical attractiveness becomes a valid reason to break a covenant. It just reduces the wife to a temporary servant who can be replaced at any time.
So Hillel's view completely trivialized the covenant bond. What Moses allowed because of wickedness was now being used to justify pure selfishness.
Precisely. The legal fence that was built to protect people from cruelty was repurposed into a convenient escape hatch. Men could hide their sin behind a cloak of religious legality. #TagShould the peril of procedural correctness.
And that trivializing of the grounds for divorce set the stage for the second major problem that Jesus takes on.
Which is the obsession with procedure over morality.
Yes, Jesus quotes the popular saying of his day, "Whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce."
And that saying is so revealing because look what it leaves out.
It's completely selective.
It is. It focuses only on the external piece of paper, the procedure, and it totally omits any mention of the cause, the indecency that the original Mosaic law required.
Just bureaucratic box checking. Got the paper, you're fine.
That's the peril, exactly. The process became a kind of bureaucratic shield for a hard heart. As long as a man followed the procedure, got the certificate written up, he could feel like his conscience was clear.
No matter how cruel or selfish his real reason was.
It didn't matter. This legalistic minimalism created a deadly sense of complacency. It was a way to hide treachery right under a thin layer of procedural correctness.
So they managed to turn a reluctant permission for hardness of heart into a simple administrative formula. The concession became a license.
It did. And Jesus shows that focusing on the certificate reduces this massive requirement of kingdom righteousness to just an external act. A husband could use that piece of paper to make his sinful desires look respectable.
Using human laws to sanitize his own unfaithfulness.
And wrongly believing that if it's legal according to the rabbis, it must be moral before God. Jesus just insists that a certificate can't clear your conscience before the one who sees the heart.
And that whole context is what makes Christ's words in the Sermon on the Mount so explosive. He doesn't just offer a small critique. He asserts his own authority and yanks the standard for marriage back to where it belongs.
Right back to God's design. He insists on a righteousness that goes into the heart, way beyond just external procedures. #A, surpassing the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees.
He sets this up right away in Matthew 5:20. He says, your righteousness has to surpass that of the scribes and Pharisees to even enter the kingdom.
And their righteousness was all external, wasn't it? It was something you could measure. I didn't murder anyone. I didn't commit the physical act of adultery. I gave the certificate. Check, check, check.
But Christ demands a righteousness that gets underneath all of that. It has to go to the motive, the intention, the hidden thoughts that no human law can ever touch.
And he uses that formula, you have heard that it was said, but I say to you. He uses that to do two things. First, he's confronting their comfortable domesticated tradition that was based on Hillel's easy rules. And second, he's reasserting the original seriousness of the law. He's rescuing Moses from their misuse.
He's basically saying, you think you're righteous because you checked a box, but God's law demands truth in the inner person.
And that move from the external act to the internal motive is probably the most radical thing Jesus does in the whole sermon. It completely redefines what sin is. Hashtag tag be hard adultery and outward dissolution.
And you can see that redefinition so clearly in the way Matthew organizes this section of the sermon.
There's a crucial link here. Jesus doesn't treat lust and divorce as two separate topics. He connects the inward sin of lust directly to the outward act of dissolving a marriage.
So let's trace that sequence. Where does the sin actually begin for Jesus?
It begins in the verses right before the teaching on divorce. He exposes lust as heart adultery.
Matthew 5:27-28.
Right. To look at a woman with lustful intent is to have already committed adultery with her in your heart. So the sin begins inside, in the desire, long before it ever becomes a public scandal or a legal action.
And so the teaching on divorce that follows immediately after that shows how that inner sin works its way out into the real world.
Exactly. It shows how it affects life's structures and decisions. A man who lets sinful desire rule his heart, who is lusting after another woman, will eventually want to act on it.
And he might try to make it look respectable.
He might try to cloak his infidelity in legal respectability. He divorces his wife, gets the certificate from the Hillelite rabbi, and marries the other woman. The world might call that moving on.
But Jesus calls it what it is.
He calls it adultery, multiplied and socially sanctioned. He sees the direct line from the lust in the heart to the treachery of the divorce.
So the outward divorce is just a legal cover story for the inward sin of lust and wanting a new partner.
It's an attempt to baptize unfaithfulness with a piece of paper. And Jesus just rips the cover off that. He insists you can't dissolve a marriage based on your desires because God's covenant is still in effect. Hashtag CC, the moral stain of unjust divorce.
And Jesus makes it clear that an unjust divorce is not some morally neutral event.
Yeah.
He says, everyone who divorces his wife, except on the ground of sexual immorality, makes her commit adultery.
That is a staggering statement.
It is. The moral weight is placed entirely on the man who initiated it.
It puts the guilt right where the treachery started. And to really feel the force of that, you have to understand the social situation for a woman in first century Judea.
A woman dismissed by her husband was in a very dangerous position.
Perilous. She lost her economic security, her social standing. Often she had no choice but to find a new husband just to survive.
So if the first marriage was dissolved without a biblical reason, meaning in God's eyes the covenant was still valid, then she's still bound to her first husband.
That's right. So her next marriage, even if she entered it out of necessity, is adulterous in God's sight because the original divine bond is still there.
And Jesus says the first husband is the one responsible for that entire chain of sin.
He says the husband made her commit adultery. He's guilty not just for his own treachery, but for creating the immoral situation that forced her into an adulterous union. He's the one who broke the covenant, no matter what his certificate says.
And then he gives that final warning. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery, assuming, of course, the first divorce was unjust.
And that just shatters the illusion that if something is legal, it must be moral. An unjust divorce, even if the local rabbi signed off on it, is still a covenant-breaking act before God. Christ is drawing a hard line between human law and divine righteousness.
Okay, so we've set up this incredibly high standard from creation, which Jesus affirms. But the New Testament is also realistic.
Yeah.
It recognizes that this covenant bond can be shattered by certain very serious sins. These are the grounds where a divorce might be permitted without that charge of adultery following a remarriage.
This is a really important point of pastoral clarity because while divorce is never God's ideal, there are two kinds of grave sin that so violate the one flesh union that, yes, a dissolution may be permitted. Hashtag A, sexual immorality, porneia.
The only explicit exception that Jesus himself gives is, except on the ground of sexual immorality. That's the exception clause that makes all the difference.
It does. And the specific Greek word that Matthew records Jesus using here is porneia. And that's a deliberately broad word.
It's not the specific word for adultery.
No, the specific word for adultery is moikeia. Porneia is much more general. It covers all kinds of illicit sexual activity, fornication, prostitution, incest, and adultery.
So why would Jesus choose the broader term when he's talking about marriage?
I think the use of porneia shows that the offense that breaks the covenant isn't limited just to the act of adultery. It covers any kind of illicit sexual union that destroys the sanctity of that one flesh bond.
So, for example, if a marriage turned out to be incestuous under the Old Testament law,
That would be covered. The point Jesus is making is that sexual unfaithfulness, in all its ugly forms, is a breach so serious that dissolution can be permitted. And the reason is that the one flesh reality has been shattered by the guilty person.
So in a way, the act of porneia has already broken the covenant.
That's the key. The bond is dissolved by the unfaithful person's action. The legal paperwork that follows is just the official recognition of a spiritual and physical break that's already happened.
Which means the remarriage of the innocent party doesn't have that same adulterous character.
Right, because the covenant was already torn by the one who was unfaithful.
But even here, even with this clear exception, divorce is still a concession. It's not a command.
That's so important for pastoral care. Just because you have permission doesn't mean you have an obligation. The person who is sinned against may divorce, but they are not required to. Forgiveness and reconciliation are always the higher goal if they're possible. But the door for dissolution is open. Hashtag be willful desertion.
And the New Testament gives us a second ground, a second sin that violates the marriage covenant so deeply that a dissolution is permitted.
Yes, and this one comes from the Apostle Paul.
We're talking about willful desertion.
That's right, from 1 Corinthians 7. The context is usually a believer married to an unbeliever, and the unbelieving spouse decides to leave the marriage for good, specifically because of their partner's Christian faith.
And Paul says, if the unbelieving partner separates, let it be so. In such cases, the brother or sister is not enslaved.
Not enslaved. That's the key phrase.
So why is desertion treated with the same level of seriousness as porneia?
The Reformed view has generally held that persistent, unrepentant adultery or this kind of willful desertion are the two sins that can shatter the covenant. Desertion, especially when it's driven by hostility to the faith, is seen as a fundamental act of covenant treachery.
It's a kind of spiritual death blow to the marriage.
It is. When the unbelieving spouse leaves, they are actively choosing to destroy the covenant. And Paul says the believer who has been deserted is not enslaved, which grants them the freedom to dissolve that relationship and, if needed, to remarry.
Because the original purpose of the marriage has been irreversibly destroyed by the one who left.
Exactly. So even with the high ideal of permanence, these two grave acts, sexual unfaithfulness and malicious abandonment, are recognized as sins that have already ravaged God's good gift.
And the church has to hold both of those things in balance. The high standard from creation and the sad reality of covenant-breaking sin.
That's the challenge. Divorce is always a tragedy, but in these two specific cases, it's a sad recognition of a break that has already happened.
It's so important to see that Jesus' high standard for marriage isn't just an arbitrary rule. It's not just about being strict for the sake of being strict.
No, it's tied directly to something much bigger. It points to the ultimate divine relationship. It reveals what Paul calls the mystery of marriage. #A. The living parable of Christ and the church.
This theological link really changes how we see marriage. It's not just a personal arrangement anymore.
Yeah.
It becomes a living parable.
It does. Paul, in Ephesians 5, says that earthly marriage is a mystery that refers to Christ and the church.
So every marriage is supposed to be a picture of that relationship.
A tangible, living picture of it. Christ is the true bridegroom. The whole story of the Bible contrasts the infidelity of Israel, which is called spiritual adultery, with God's steadfast faithfulness as a husband, even when his people wander off.
So spouses are called to reflect that, to reflect the steadfast, sacrificial love of the bridegroom who never, ever casts away his own.
That's the high calling. To love as Christ loved the church, giving himself up for her, making her holy, cleansing her.
That's an immense weight for any marriage to carry.
It is. Every marriage becomes this little, fragile mirror reflecting the vast, permanent covenant between Christ and his people. And that whole story ends with the great marriage supper of the Lamb in Revelation 19.
The final union.
The final consummation, when Christ is fully united with his bride, the church. Our earthly covenants are meant to point to that perfect fidelity, and when they break, that sacred image gets distorted. #be law, gospel, and pastoral counsel.
So the teaching of Jesus in Matthew 5, it's not just a historical debate. It functions as law for us today. It exposes our own self-righteousness.
It does, and it confronts a few very common modern errors.
Like what?
Well, first, it confronts secular autonomy, the idea that marriage is just a fluid contract for my personal fulfillment. Second, it confronts that legalistic minimalism we talked about, hiding sin behind paperwork.
And third,
Third, and maybe this is the most common one today, it confronts the therapeutic approach, the one that uses vague, non-biblical ideas like incompatibility or we just fell out of love as legitimate grounds for divorce.
so the church has a duty here to speak clearly, to actually call unjust divorce and illegitimate remarriage what Jesus calls them sin, adultery.
Yes. We can't afford to call evil good or to smooth over what Jesus calls covenant treachery, but this is where the gospel has to come right after the law.
The law is sharp for a reason.
It's sharp so that the grace of Christ doesn't seem cheap. The gospel is fully sufficient for real covenant breakers, for real adulterers. Christ bore the judgment that these sins deserved. His blood is enough, even for the most tangled stories of marital failure.
So the church shouldn't be a museum for people with perfect marital records.
No, it should be a hospital, a place where the wounded can be cleansed and set on a new path of repentance and discipleship.
And that requires a careful pastoral balance.
A very careful balance. The church has to be courageous about God's standard, never lowering it, but at the same time show deep compassion and announce a full pardon to sinners who repent.
It means distinguishing between the one who was sinned against and the one who pursued an unbiblical divorce.
It does, distinguishing between the victim of desertion or adultery and the person who needs to confess and seek forgiveness. The goal is always restoration, truth-telling, and holding fast to Christ's standard. #Outrelance.
So we've come full circle. We've traced marriage from the creation covenant through the Mosaic concession to the rabbinic distortion that made it all about legal convenience.
And we ended with Christ's correction, which demands a faithfulness that is rooted not in a piece of paper, but in the sincerity of the heart.
Kingdom righteousness really requires a vigilant holiness in marriage, a constant guarding of the heart.
It's a call to cultivate patience and forgiveness and sacrificial love instead of letting lust or bitterness or just plain selfishness compromise what God has put together.
The big takeaway, I think, is that stark difference between human bureaucracy and divine reality. Jesus just shatters the idea that if it's legal, it must be moral.
So maybe the ultimate question that Jesus' teaching leaves us with isn't just what are the biblical grounds for divorce. It's something more personal. It builds on that whole problem of legalistic minimalism. The question for you to mull over is this. In what specific ways am I tempted to substitute procedural correctness, that human need for box checking and external rightness, for genuine heart fidelity in my own relationships? Where am I tempted to use human structures to try and sanctify my own selfishness? That's the searching question from the Bridegroom we all have to answer.